In The Phantom Menace, we were introduced to the concept of midi-chlorians by Qui-Gon Jinn.
Midi-chlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
They live inside me.
Inside your cells, yes. And we are symbionts with them.
Symbionts?
Life forms living together for mutual advantage. Without the midi-chlorians, life could not exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force.
I don't understand.
A lot of people share Anakin's confusion, and the response to this new information wasn't universally positive, let's say.
And the Force? Well, that's just microscopic bacteria in your bloodstream called midi-chlorians.
Look, if you're not going to take this seriously, I'm out.
Midi-chlorians kind of became the poster child for over-explaining information people tended to think of as unnecessary. So naturally today I'm going to take that even further by talking even more about midi-chlorians. We're going to look at how different stories or sources or even the two different continuities use or refer to midi-chlorians, and see what they actually are. There's two main things I kind of want to keep in mind here. The first is that with the scene between Anakin and Qui-Gon, Qui-Gon is explaining this to a literal child, giving the most basic overview he can. The second is that this scene doesn't override the things we learned before, instead it's a statement made in the context of everything we already know. Midi-chlorians aren't replacing the all-encompassing energy field of the original trilogy. Robot Chicken in that sketch says the Force is actually midi-chlorians as part of the joke, but the Force and midi-chlorians aren't one and the same. Instead, the midi-chlorians are a kind of middleman through which living beings interact with the Force. One of the biggest criticisms of midi-chlorians I see is that it turns the ephemeral, mystic energy force into this quantifiable, overly explained thing, but I do want to push back on this at least slightly. Even in stories which engage heavily with the idea of midi-chlorians and the Force in a more mechanical, experimental way, it's always shown to explicitly not be some kind of compound V giving superpowers by injecting the blood kind of thing. Typically, when you get stories approaching that, it's done from the perspective of the Sith or Sith-aligned individuals exploiting and studying beings against their will with the aim of gaining personal power. Sometimes it's done from a more scientific perspective, with people wearing lab coats, that's what science means, and we see this in canon with the experiments in Mount Tantus and the Bad Batch, as well as through Moff Gideon's experiments in The Mandalorian, then eventually in Palpatine's Return to some extent. But it's also something we see in Legends, especially in the Darth Plagueis novel, which similarly recontextualizes certain Sith powers, like essence transfer, in terms of what they meant for interactions with midi-chlorians. I think what's important to realize about these experiments, though, is that they're supposed to come across as unacceptable bastardizations of what one's relationship with the Force ought to be, and they're pretty explicitly framed as this Joseph Mengele-style research. More on that in a minute, though. Let's get back to the midi-chlorians themselves. One of the more interesting individual exchanges about the midi-chlorians, in my opinion at least, comes in the Med-Star duology, where the fandom debates about midi-chlorians were kind of brought in-universe. Medical research about midi-chlorians, as one character relays, tended to take the assumption that it was midi-chlorians creating the Force connection themselves, but Barriss Offee in this conversation explains that the Jedi see it differently. The midi-chlorians were essentially agents of the Force, created and deposited by the will of the Force inside individuals in facilitating the connection. I think this is probably the easiest way to understand the midi-chlorians, and it's probably the least limiting way to understand them in terms of what it means for the Force. It also helps contextualize the Sith-led experiments better as being against the will of the Force in some way, because the presence and concentration of midi-chlorians is determined by the will of the Force, rather than the Force being created by the midi-chlorians. And this interpretation is pretty consistent with the other more prominent depictions we see in places like the Darth Plagueis novel, the Bad Batch, and so on. Plagueis is the place where we go deepest into these experiments with explicit information, and it's where we learn why you can't simply do a full blood transfusion and end up with Force powers. Quote, "Research had long ago established that blood transfusions from Force-sensitive individuals did not confer Force powers to recipients, though blood with a high midi-chlorian count could grant temporary strength and resiliency. Experiments in absolute transfusion had gone horribly awry for recipients, suggesting to some that the Force exacted a toll on those who attempted to tamper with it. An individual's midi-chlorians seemed to know to whom they belonged, and become unresponsive outside their dedicated vessel." End quote. So as much as the midichlorians are a mechanical element to interpretation and the use of the Force, they're an expression of the metaphysical side as well. It's not as simple as injecting yourself with a dose of midichlorians and then you're able to like this video and subscribe for more. George Lucas's explanations of midichlorians and Force talent have also generally involved the idea of needing a certain amount to be able to use the Force, but we still see some different interpretations and elements of that throughout the entire published history of Star Wars. Even before the idea of midichlorians was openly discussed, you tended to have familial inheritance of Force sensitivity, though not always, which does tie into the more biologically determined midichlorian counts and Force access. Although even then, not all people born to Force sensitives are themselves Force sensitive, and not all Force sensitives are born to other Force sensitives. One thing that is kind of fun here though is that in the Jedi Academy trilogy novels that were published before the prequels, Luke is looking for potential trainees, and the way he finds them is actually using this kind of device to scan them. It's not exactly the same as Qui-Gon taking the blood sample, but it's at least working along kind of similar lines. Also, unlike Qui-Gon, I don't think Luke lies to the people he's scanning about what he's actually doing. But when it comes to individual Force sensitivity and midichlorian counts, the more you try to mess with this on a purely mechanical level, the worse it tends to go. Aside from the Sith, the noble families of the planet Vijun were known to value midichlorian count as a kind of social status, so they tended to try to experiment with boosting their own counts. The result was simply to drive the population mostly insane. In canon, the harvesting of midichlorians from a high M-count individual is the reason the Empire wants Grogu, and Dr. Pershing was hoping to continue experimenting with Grogu's blood. But even in their best attempts, the experiments resulted in rejected blood and no permanent increase in midichlorians, let alone additional Force powers. There are some more successful experiments with midichlorians in Legends, specifically in Darth Plagueis, but not necessarily the transference of them. Instead, Palpatine's master, Darth Plagueis, is able to learn to successfully manipulate midichlorians within other beings, and then himself, and he explains how interactions with midichlorians work behind certain dark side Force powers. On the simpler side, he says that he and other Sith had long ago learned to sense midichlorian counts within individuals, specifically when the count was sufficient for an individual to be Force sensitive, which is how they were able to find prospective non-Jedi apprentices. But one thing we see pretty consistently is that Force sensitivity is kind of a baseline relative function that kind of is informed by midichlorian count, rather than reaching a certain number of midichlorians and then you're either Force sensitive or not. Coruscant Nights has a character who's trying to measure his midichlorian count, and he finds out it's only an average of about 2,000 per cell. As far as this character is concerned, this means he is never going to be able to do anything significant with the Force. But both canon and Legends have explored the idea of people with lower innate sensitivity learning to use the Force to some extent. Sabine is of course the big example in canon, who makes at least some progress after years of trying. And in Legends, the aging former smuggler George Cardass demonstrates some powers he was able to learn after decades of training with the Angti monks. The Jedi also had many trainees on the cusp of what they would consider useful Force sensitivity, who then get sent off to literally live on a farm if they don't show enough skill and development. It's an actual farm, it's not a euphemism for killing them. The idea that these trainees might have shown that skill, though, I think also reinforces the idea that capability is not a direct translation from midichlorians. The New Essential Guide to Alien Species even explicitly states that the Togruta were typically able to demonstrate heightened Force sensitivity despite average midichlorian counts. Plagueis' experiments tend to go more in the direction of life extension and resurrection than power transference. One of the biggest obstacles he ran into, or at least the thing that he was most interested in studying at first, was that when the being to whom midichlorians belonged died, the midichlorians would just return themselves to the Force again, tied to the fact that, as we mentioned earlier, they knew who they were bonded with in some kind of way. Plagueis' experiments involved examining the midichlorians of those he killed, and essentially trying to keep them around. According to him, the ancient Sith learned how to draw the energies released upon a death and the return of the midichlorians to the Force into themselves, and that was how ancient Sith were able to transfer their souls upon death, something Palpatine also later learned to do in both continuities. Over time, Plagueis gained more and more success in his attempts to manipulate midichlorians directly, influencing them to heal himself and to stick around after the moment of death in others, allowing him to execute and then reanimate Darth Venomous, another trainee of his former master, upon whose comatose body he had been experimenting for decades. He would kill him, keep the midichlorians around, and then force them to reanimate the body. This success pushed him to go even further. He had taken regular measurements of his own midichlorians and found them increasing over time, something that we have seen others fail to do with transfusions, but through his own experiments he was able to accomplish in some way. But more importantly, he began experimenting with the creation of life directly. His powers of resurrection and healing started from the principle that he could influence another's midichlorians through his own much more easily than influencing his own directly. And then the midichlorians could be convinced to influence cell growth and regeneration. While creating life seems like a simple step beyond this, when he tried, the Force seemed to start fighting back. Quote, "The Force grew silent as if in flight from him, and many of the animals in his laboratory succumbed to horrifying diseases." So I think this approach really helps highlight how the mechanical explanation of the midichlorians as a conduit for Force sensitivity doesn't necessarily need to remove or limit the metaphysical elements, and when handled properly it can even help reinforce them. This is especially true when you stop thinking about everything presented to you in universe as being just like this smorgasbord of information that is all true on its own, and instead you think about the characters who are interacting in each way. We're not really supposed to think that the way in which the Sith and the Empire are going about getting this information is actually the best way to get good, accurate, useful, non-selfish information. That's going to do it for today though. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.